The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when we buried my son. I stood under a black umbrella in Cedar Grove Cemetery, watching the casket lower into the wet Oregon earth, and felt something inside me descend with it. Darian had been my only child, my miracle baby, born when I was 40 years old and had given up hope of motherhood. Now, at 70, I was burying him at just 30. The cancer had been merciless and swift. Beside me, my daughter-in-law Simone sobbed into a tissue, her shoulders shaking beneath her elegant black coat. She had always been beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and honey-colored hair that fell in perfect waves. Even in grief, she maintained that polished appearance. I reached out and squeezed her hand, and she gripped mine back with surprising force. People filed past offering condolences. Neighbors from the small coastal town where I'd lived for decades. Darian's colleagues from the construction company. Friends I hadn't seen in years. Their words blurred together into a meaningless hum. When it was over, Simone turned to me with red-rimmed eyes. "Mom, Delphine, I don't know how I'll survive this," she whispered. I pulled her into an embrace, feeling her thin frame tremble against mine. At that moment, I believed we would grieve together, that our shared loss would bind us. I had no idea how wrong I was. Chapter 2. The week after the funeral passed in a fog. I moved through my small craftsman house like a ghost, unable to eat, unable to sleep. Photographs of Darian covered every surface. Him as a baby with downy dark hair. Him graduating high school with that crooked smile. Him on his wedding day, looking at Simone like she hung the moon. That last image made my chest ache. On the 8th day, I finally opened the envelope Darian's attorney had given me. My hands shook as I unfolded the papers inside. Darian had been meticulous about planning for his death once the diagnosis came. The documents outlined his will with painful precision. To Simone, he left their house in Portland and his personal savings account, roughly $80,000, standard provisions for a surviving spouse. But there was more, much more. Years ago, when Darian was just 25, my late husband had passed away and left him a considerable inheritance. Darian had invested wisely. He'd purchased a working farm in the Willamette Valley, 3 rental apartments in Eugene, and he'd kept a separate bank account that had grown substantially over the years. All of it had been placed in my name only. I read the executor's note 3 times, not quite believing it. The farm alone was worth over $1 million. The apartments generated substantial monthly income. The bank account held another $400,000. Darian had made me wealthy, and he'd done it in secret. I sat at my kitchen table as afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, trying to understand why. Why had he structured things this way? Why hadn't he told Simone? And most troubling, why had he felt the need to hide it from her? The attorney's business card sat beside the papers. I should call him. I should ask questions. Instead, I slipped everything back into the envelope and locked it in my desk drawer. Something told me to wait, to watch, to see what happened next. That instinct would save me. Chapter 3. Simone called the next morning. "Mom, Delphine, I was hoping we could have lunch today. I need to talk to you about something important." Her voice sounded different, lighter somehow, less burdened by grief. I told myself I was imagining things, that everyone processed loss differently. We met at a small cafe downtown, one of those places with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls. Simone arrived 15 minutes late, wearing designer sunglasses and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She ordered a salad she barely touched and got straight to the point. "I've been going through Darian's papers," she began, stirring her iced tea with mechanical precision. "And I'm trying to get a complete picture of our financial situation. Did he mention any other assets to you? Any accounts or properties I should know about?" The question hung in the air between us. I took a slow sip of my coffee, buying time. Something in her tone set off alarm bells. This wasn't a grieving widow trying to sort through her late husband's affairs. This was someone hunting for something specific. Not that I'm aware of," I said carefully. "He kept his financial matters pretty private. Why do you ask?" Simone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's just that some things don't add up. Darian was always talking about investments, about building something for our future. But all I can find is the house and 1 savings account. It seems like there should be more." She leaned forward, and I caught a whiff of her expensive perfume. "You were his mother. Surely he confided in you about his plans, about what he'd built. The pressure in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't a casual question. This was an interrogation. I met her gaze steadily, my heart pounding. Darian shared very little with me about money matters, dear. He was a private person that way. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had never discussed the specifics with me while he was alive. I'd only learned about it after his death. Simone sat back, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Frustration, maybe even anger. Then she smiled, and it was like watching a mask slide into place. Of course. I'm sorry for prying. Grief makes me paranoid, I suppose. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew my decision to stay silent had been the right one. Chapter 4. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed watching shadows move across the ceiling, thinking about Simone's questions, about the cold calculation in her eyes. At 2 a.m, I gave up on rest and went to my computer. I'd never been particularly tech-savvy, but my grandson had taught me the basics before Darian got sick. I opened a search engine and typed in Simone's full name, Simone Adrienne Whitmore. What I found made my blood run cold. There were court records from Nevada, a lawsuit from 2018 involving fraud allegations. The case had been settled out of court, details sealed, but the outline was clear enough. Simone had been accused of manipulating an elderly man's finances while working as his home health aide. I kept digging. A marriage license from 2015 to a man named Gerald Brennan. A divorce finalized just 6 months before she met Darian. An obituary for Gerald from that same year. He died of a sudden heart attack at age 68. There were more names, more connections. A pattern emerging like a photograph developing in chemicals. Simone had a history of relationships with older, financially comfortable men. Relationships that ended in death or divorce. Always with her walking away with substantial assets. My Darian had been her youngest target at 30, but he'd also been dying, vulnerable, and apparently wealthier than she'd realized. I printed everything I could find and created a folder. My hands trembled as I worked. This was the woman I'd welcomed into my family, the woman I'd held while she cried at my son's funeral, the woman who was now hunting for money she believed she was entitled to. Dawn was breaking when I finally shut down the computer. I made myself a cup of tea with shaking hands and sat at my kitchen table, watching the sun rise over the Pacific through my window. Darian had known. Somehow, he'd known what she was. That's why he'd protected his assets. Protected me. And now I understood that I was in danger. Chapter 5. The next few days passed in tense silence. Simone didn't call, which felt like a reprieve and a threat all at once. I knew she was out there, planning something. I could feel it in my bones. I contacted Darian's attorney, a stern man named Marcus Holloway, and requested a meeting. When I showed him what I'd discovered about Simone, his expression grew grave. Mrs. Pemberton, I need to tell you something, he said, leaning back in his leather chair. Darian came to me about 6 months before he died. He'd discovered some troubling information about his wife, and he wanted to ensure his assets were protected. He opened a file on his desk. He hired a private investigator. What you found is only the beginning. Simone has been involved in at least 4 similar situations over the past 15 years. There's strong suspicion, though never proven, that she may have hastened at least 2 of those deaths. The room spun around me. You're saying she might have murdered them. Marcus chose his words carefully. I'm saying the pattern is suspicious enough that Darian wanted to ensure you were protected. That's why everything was placed in your name with ironclad legal protections. If Simone tries to claim any of it, she'll have to go through a legal battle that will expose her entire history. I gripped the arms of my chair. Why didn't he leave her? Why stay married to someone like that? Marcus's expression softened. He told me he didn't have the strength to fight a divorce while fighting cancer, and he worried that if he left her with nothing, she might try to harm you to get access to his estate. This way, you're protected, and she has enough to move on with her life. My son had spent his final months not just battling disease, but protecting me from a predator in our midst. I left Marcus's office with a new understanding of how much Darian had sacrificed, and how carefully I would need to proceed. Chapter 6. Simone made her move exactly 1 week after our lunch. I was in my garden, trying to find solace among the roses Darian had planted for me years ago, when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the fence, I saw Simone emerge with another woman, someone tall and severe-looking in a gray pantsuit. They knocked on my door with sharp, businesslike raps. When I answered, Simone's smile didn't reach her eyes. I'm Mom Delphine. This is Patricia Voss, my attorney. We need to discuss Darian's estate. I invited them in, my heart hammering, but I kept my face neutral. Years of being a nurse had taught me how to maintain composure in crisis situations. Patricia Voss got straight to the point. Mrs. Pemberton, my client has reason to believe that her late husband possessed assets beyond those disclosed in his will. As his widow, she has a legal right to know about and potentially claim those assets. I sat down slowly in my armchair. I'm not aware of any undisclosed assets, I said calmly. Simone leaned forward, her facade cracking. Don't lie to me. I know Darian had more. He talked about investments, about the farm his father left him, about rental properties. Where is it all, Delphine? The use of my first name, without the affectionate Mom, told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. I looked at Patricia Voss. If you have questions about my son's estate, I suggest you contact his attorney, Marcus Halloway. I'm a 70-year-old woman who just buried her only child. I don't appreciate being ambushed in my own home. Patricia handed me a business card. I will be filing a legal inquiry into Darian's complete financial holdings. If you're withholding information about community property, there will be consequences. After they left, I sat in the silence of my house and cried. Not from fear, but from fury. This woman had parasitized my dying son, and now she wanted to take even the protection he'd tried to give me. But I wasn't going to let her. I called Marcus immediately. Nabertor, Chapter 7. Marcus moved quickly. Within 48 hours, he'd filed a protective order on my behalf and begun preparing a defense against any claims Simone might make. More importantly, he'd contacted the private investigator Darian had hired. Her name was Raina DeMarco, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement before going private. She met me at a coffee shop in neighboring Astoria, where we were less likely to be recognized. Your son was a smart man, Mrs. Pemberton, Raina said, sliding a thick folder across the table. He knew exactly who he'd married, and he documented everything. Inside were photographs, bank records, phone logs, evidence of Simone meeting with her previous husband's financial advisor just weeks after Gerald Brennan's death, records showing large cash withdrawals from elderly clients she'd cared for, a pattern so clear it was damning. Why hasn't she been prosecuted? I asked. Raina's expression was grim. She's careful, always stays just on the edge of what can be proven. Her victims are usually dead or too compromised to testify. Families settle to avoid the pain of public trials. She's been doing this for years, moving from state to state, reinventing herself. She pulled out another document, but this time she made a mistake. She genuinely didn't know about the assets Darian placed in your name. She married him thinking he was moderately comfortable, planning to inherit a nice nest egg. When she realized there was more and she couldn't find it, she got desperate. Raina leaned in. I've been tracking unusual activity. 3 days ago, someone tried to access your medical records through a fake insurance inquiry. Yesterday, someone called the county assessor's office asking about properties in your name. Simone is building a case to have you declared incompetent, so she can claim she should have been managing Darian's estate all along. The coffee in my stomach turned to acid, and she's trying to make me look senile. Raina nodded. It's her pattern when direct manipulation doesn't work. She'll try to prove you're not fit to manage assets, that you're confused about what belongs to you versus what should be community property. If she succeeds, she can tie everything up in court for years and bleed you dry in legal fees. I thought about my small house, my simple life. I'd never wanted wealth. I'd been a nurse for 40 years, living modestly, saving carefully. The money Darian left me was overwhelming, almost burdensome in its magnitude. But I'd be damned if I'd let this woman take what my son died trying to protect. What do I do? I asked. Raina smiled, and there was something fierce in it. We fight back, and we document everything. Meyer Chapter 8. The next 2 weeks were a chess game played across legal documents and private investigations. Simone escalated her campaign, filing papers claiming I was withholding marital assets. Patricia Voss sent increasingly threatening letters. But Marcus and Raina were ready. They compiled a dossier that outlined every suspicious death, every elderly victim, every pattern of financial manipulation in Simone's history. They documented her attempts to access my personal information illegally. They built a case that, while it might not be enough for criminal prosecution, would destroy her credibility in any civil proceeding. The turning point came when Raina discovered something even I hadn't known. Darian's cancer treatment record showed irregularities in his medication schedule during his final weeks. Nothing definitive, nothing that could prove wrongdoing, but enough to raise disturbing questions. Times when Simone was alone with him, and his pain medication dosages increased beyond what his doctors had prescribed. I sat in Marcus's office, staring at the timeline Raina had created, and felt something shatter inside me. "You think she hastened his death?" I whispered. Marcus exchanged a glance with Raina. "We think it's possible." The hospice nurses noted some concerns in their reports, but attributed it to a grieving spouse's misunderstanding of palliative care protocols. But combined with her history, I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too hot. My son might not have had much time left, but what little he had could have been stolen from him by the woman sleeping beside him. "Can we prove it?" I asked. Raina shook her head slowly. "Not to a criminal standard, but we can present it as part of a larger pattern. Combined with everything else, it paints a picture of someone with a documented history of financial predation and suspected involvement in suspicious deaths." I made a decision then, one that would change everything. I want to meet with her, face to face. No lawyers, just the two of us. Marcus started to protest, but I held up my hand. I need to look her in the eye. I need to understand who she really is. And I need her to know that I know. It took 3 days to arrange. Simone agreed to meet me at my house, probably thinking she could manipulate me more easily on familiar ground. She had no idea what was coming. Chapter 9. Simone arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of clear Pacific Northwest day where you can see forever. She wore casual clothes, jeans, and a soft sweater, looking younger than her 38 years, playing the role of the grieving young widow. I served tea in my living room, surrounded by photographs of Darian at every age. I wanted his presence there, wanted him to witness this. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Simone began, her voice honey-sweet. "I think we've let lawyers complicate what should be a simple family matter." I poured the tea with steady hands. "Tell me, Simone, how did you meet Darian?" She seemed surprised by the question. "At a hospital benefit? I was volunteering. He was donating. Why?" I handed her a cup. "And before Darian, you were married to Gerald Brennan. Before Gerald, there was Thomas Marlowe. Before Thomas, Richard Chen. Should I continue?" The color drained from her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." I opened the folder on my coffee table and began laying out photographs, bank statements, death certificates, legal documents spanning 15 years, each of them older than you, each of them dead within 3 years of marriage, each of them leaving you substantially wealthier than before. Simone stood abruptly, tea sloshing onto my carpet. "You're crazy. This is grief, making you paranoid." I remained seated, looking up at her with eyes that had seen too much in 70 years to be fooled anymore. Darian knew. That's why he protected his assets. That's why everything is in my name, untouchable by you. He spent his last months not just dying, but saving me from you. Her mask finally cracked. The sweet, grieving widow disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You self-righteous old woman," she hissed. "Your precious son wasn't the saint you think he was. He was weak and pathetic, crying about his mortality, clinging to me like I was his salvation." She leaned down, her face inches from mine. I gave him comfort in his final days. I deserved to be compensated for that sacrifice. The admission hung in the air between us. Not quite a confession, but close enough. "Compensated," I repeated softly. "Is that what you call it when you steal from dying men?" Simone straightened, regaining some of her composure. "You have no proof of anything criminal, and whatever smear campaign you're planning, it won't work. I'll sue you for defamation and take everything you have." I stood then, meeting her gaze. "You're welcome to try. But know this, every piece of evidence we have will become public record. Every suspicious death, every elderly victim, every dollar you've stolen. Your name will be destroyed." I walked to my front door and opened it. "You have a choice, Simone. Walk away with what Darian left you in his will, $80,000 in the Portland house. Start over somewhere else. Or fight this battle and lose everything, including your freedom if we find enough evidence to press criminal charges." For a long moment, she stood there, vibrating with rage. Then she smiled, and it was like looking at something inhuman. "This isn't over." She walked out, and I watched her drive away, knowing she was right. It wasn't over yet. Chapter 10. Simone filed a massive lawsuit 3 days later. She claimed emotional distress, defamation, and unlawful withholding of marital assets. The sum she demanded was staggering, $5 million. Marcus had warned me this might happen. She's trying to scare you into settling, he explained. Most people her age would fold under this kind of pressure. She doesn't realize you've spent a lifetime dealing with life and death situations. A lawsuit doesn't frighten you the way it might frighten someone else. He was right. I'd held dying patients' hands. I'd told families there was nothing more we could do. I'd worked double shifts during flu epidemics and natural disasters. A legal battle, while unpleasant, was just another challenge to endure, but it took its toll. The stress triggered an old heart condition. I ended up in the emergency room one night, chest pains radiating down my arm. The doctors said it was stress-induced angina, not a full heart attack, but it was a warning. I was 70 years old. This fight was quite literally killing me. Lying in that hospital bed, hooked to monitors, I had a moment of clarity. I could win this battle and lose my health. I could spend my remaining years, however many they were, in courtrooms and lawyers, offices, fighting to protect money I'd never asked for. Or I could make a different choice. When I was discharged, I called an emergency meeting with Marcus and Raina. I want to settle, I told them. Marcus started to protest, but I held up my hand. Not on her terms, on mine. Over the next week, we crafted an offer. Simone would receive an additional $200,000 from the estate, bringing her total to $280,000. In exchange, she would sign a comprehensive settlement agreement that included a non-disclosure clause and a permanent waiver of any future claims against Darian's estate or my personal assets. Most importantly, she would agree to leave Oregon and not contact me again. The money hurt. It felt like rewarding a predator, but it was a fraction of what Darian had protected, and it would buy me peace. Simone's attorney countered with $350,000. We settled at $300,000. The day we signed the final papers, I felt something inside me uncurl. It wasn't justice. It wasn't victory. But it was survival. And at 70 years old, survival mattered. Simone took the money and disappeared. Last I heard, she'd moved to Arizona, probably already hunting for her next target. Chapter 11. In the months that followed, I had to learn how to live with what I'd learned. The woman I'd believed was grieving my son alongside me had been a predator. The last months of Darian's life had been shadowed by manipulation and possible murder. I saw a therapist, an older woman named Dr. Keiko Sato, who specialized in trauma and grief. She helped me understand that I could mourn both the son I'd lost and the betrayal I'd discovered. Grief isn't linear, she told me during one session, and it's complicated when the person you're mourning made choices that put you in danger, even if they also tried to protect you. Darian had known what Simone was, and stayed with her anyway. Part of me was angry at him for not telling me, for putting himself in that position, but another part understood. He'd been dying, exhausted, and trying to manage an impossible situation. He'd done the best he could with the time and strength he had. I started making changes to my life. I sold the farm in the Willamette Valley to a young couple who wanted to continue its organic practices. I donated a significant portion of the proceeds to cancer research in Darian's name. I kept the 3 rental apartments but hired a property manager to handle them. The income would fund my retirement comfortably without the stress of direct management. The money Darian had left me became a tool for honoring his memory in ways that felt meaningful. I established a scholarship at his high school for students pursuing careers in construction and trades. I supported the hospice center that had cared for him in his final days. But I also kept enough to secure my own future, to ensure I wouldn't be vulnerable to anyone else's manipulation. Chapter 12. A year after Darian's death, I stood in Cedar Grove Cemetery again. The rain had returned, soft and persistent, making the grass glisten. I placed fresh flowers on my son's grave, daisies and forget-me-nots, his favorites. The headstone was simple. Darian Michael Pemberton, beloved son. We'd left off husband at my insistence. Some truths were too painful to memorialize. I hope you're at peace now, I whispered to the stone. Free from pain, free from her. An older man approached, someone I'd noticed visiting a nearby grave regularly. His name was Warren, a retired teacher whose wife had passed away 2 years earlier. We'd struck up a cautious friendship, bonding over shared grief and the strange rituals of cemetery visits. Beautiful flowers, he said softly. Thank you. We stood together in comfortable silence, two survivors who understood that healing doesn't mean forgetting. Later, we had coffee at a small cafe downtown. Warren told me about his grandchildren. I told him about the scholarship fund. We talked about simple things, building a careful foundation of trust. I'd learned to be cautious, to protect myself, to recognize red flags and trust my instincts. But I'd also learned that isolation wasn't the answer, that a life lived in fear of betrayal was its own kind of death. Simone had taken my son from me, whether directly or indirectly. She'd stolen months that should have been sacred. She'd poisoned my memories of his final chapter. But she hadn't taken everything. I still had my health, mostly. I still had the resources to live independently and help others. I still had the capacity to form new connections, carefully and with wisdom, earned through pain. The lesson Darian had taught me wasn't just about protecting assets. It was about protecting yourself while still remaining open to love and trust. About being strong enough to fight when necessary, but wise enough to know when to step back. As I drove home that evening, the Pacific Ocean spread out to my left, vast and indifferent to human dramas. I thought about the women Simone would target next, the lives she would touch with her particular brand of poison. I'd sent all the evidence we'd compiled to authorities in Arizona, flagging her presence. It might not stop her, but it was something. Sometimes, survival isn't about winning. It's about enduring, about taking the blows and still standing, about protecting what matters while accepting that you can't save everyone. I pulled into my driveway as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Inside my small house, I would make dinner for one. I would water the roses Darian had planted. I would call my therapist and schedule next week's appointment. I would live, not the life I'd imagined when my son was born 30 years ago, full of grandchildren and golden anniversaries, but a life nonetheless, one shaped by loss and betrayal, but also by resilience and the stubborn insistence that I deserved peace in my final years. Darian's inheritance had been more than money and property. It had been a lesson about human nature, about the masks people wear, about the importance of protecting yourself even when you want to believe in the best of others. I locked my door that night, checked the new security system I'd installed, and settled into my favorite chair with a book. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and I was okay, not happy, not whole, but surviving, with eyes wide open and a heart that had learned to be both cautious and still capable of warmth. That would have to be enough. The end. Epilogue. 5 years had passed since I signed those settlement papers. I sat on my back porch, watching the morning fog roll in from the Pacific, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in my hands. At 75, I'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments, the way the light filtered through the mist, the sound of seagulls calling in the distance, the simple fact of being alive to witness another day. The years had been kinder than I'd expected. Warren and I had become close companions, though we'd never married. We'd both learned too much about the complications of legal entanglements to rush into anything official. Instead, we spent evenings playing chess, took long walks along the beach, and maintained separate homes that felt safer than any shared space could. He knew about Simone. I'd told him everything one night, needing him to understand why I was so careful, why I kept certain walls up. He'd listened without judgment, then shared his own story of a business partner who'd nearly destroyed him financially years ago. We were two wounded people who'd found companionship without demanding healing we couldn't provide. The scholarship fund in Darian's name had sent 12 young people to trade school. I attended every graduation, sitting in the audience and watching these kids cross the stage, thinking about the man my son could have been if he'd had more time, if he'd never met Simone. The rental properties continued generating income, managed efficiently by a company that never bothered me unless absolutely necessary. I'd donated hundreds of thousands to cancer research, to hospice care, to organizations that supported elder abuse victims. Money, I'd learned, was just a tool. It could buy security, but not peace. It could fund good works, but not erase bad memories. 2 years ago, I'd received a letter from Arizona. A detective named Luis Ramirez had contacted me, asking about the documentation I'd sent regarding Simone. He'd been investigating the death of a 73-year-old man named Howard Preston, who died suddenly just 6 months after marrying a woman matching Simone's description, though she was using a different name now. I'd provided everything Marcus and Raina had compiled. Every piece of evidence, Every pattern, every suspicion. The case was still ongoing. These things moved slowly, especially when the suspect was clever and the evidence largely circumstantial. But at least someone was paying attention. At least I'd done what I could to warn others. Last month, I'd received another update from Detective Ramirez. They'd connected Simone to 7 different identities across 4 states. The pattern was undeniable now. Multiple agencies were building a case. It might never go to trial. She might flee to another state, start again with a new name. But her freedom to operate was shrinking, and that was something. I'd learned not to expect justice in this life. Sometimes evil people prospered. Sometimes good people died too young. Sometimes the only victory was survival, and the small acts of resistance you could manage. Warren arrived around 10, carrying a bag of croissants from the bakery downtown. We ate them on the porch, talking about his grandson's upcoming wedding, about the book club we'd both joined, about whether we should take that trip to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival he'd been suggesting. Normal conversation, normal life. But there were moments when the weight of what I knew settled over me like a shroud. Moments when I looked at Darian's photograph on my mantle and wondered if those last weeks had been even worse than I'd imagined. If he'd known, in some way, that the woman beside him was hastening his death. Dr. Sato had helped me understand that I'd never know the full truth, that I had to make peace with uncertainty, with questions that would never be answered. Some days, I managed that. Other days, the anger rose up fresh and sharp, and I had to breathe through it, remind myself that carrying rage only poisoned the carrier. The hardest part was the loneliness of knowledge. I couldn't talk about this at the senior center, couldn't share it with casual acquaintances. The full story was too dark, too complex. People wanted simple narratives, the grieving mother, the tragic loss. They didn't want to hear about predators and designer clothes, about the banality of evil, about how the woman crying at the funeral might have murdered the man in the casket. Only Warren, Marcus, Reina, and Dr. Sato knew the complete story. Everyone else got the edited version. My son died of cancer. His widow and I had a disagreement about the estate. We settled, and she moved away. Clean, manageable, bearable. I'd visited Darian's grave that morning, before Warren arrived. It was his birthday. He would have been 35. I'd brought sunflowers this time, bright and defiant against the gray headstone. I'd told him about the latest scholarship recipient, a girl named Mira, who wanted to be an electrician. I'd told him about the cancer research breakthrough I'd read about, funded in part by donations from his estate. I'd told him I was okay, mostly, and that I understood why he'd done what he did. I'd also told him I was angry, that part of me would always be angry that he'd married her, stayed with her, put himself in that position, that his desire to protect me had also meant carrying a burden he shouldn't have had to carry alone. But I'd ended by telling him I loved him, that I forgave him, that I hoped, wherever he was, he'd found the peace that had eluded him in those final months. The wind had picked up then, scattering leaves across the cemetery grass, and I'd felt something shift inside me. Not closure. I'd learned that was a myth, but perhaps acceptance. A willingness to carry this weight without letting it crush me. Now, sitting on my porch with Warren beside me and the fog beginning to lift, I thought about resilience, about how it wasn't the same as strength. Strength was fighting back, standing tall, refusing to break. Resilience was breaking and reforming. It was bending without snapping. It was surviving not because you were invincible, but because you were adaptable. I was resilient, scarred, yes, wary, certainly, but still here, still capable of pleasure and connection and purpose. Simone had taken my son, had stolen months from his life, had tried to take my security and peace. But she hadn't won. Not completely, because I was still standing, still making choices, still finding small joys in croissants and chess games and foggy mornings. That wasn't the ending I would have written 5 years ago, when I was drowning in grief and betrayal. It wasn't the happy ending stories promised, where justice prevailed and good triumphed completely, but it was real. It was honest. And it was mine. Warren reached over and squeezed my hand, a simple gesture that meant, I'm here. You're not alone. I squeezed back. The fog continued to lift, revealing the ocean beyond, vast and eternal and indifferent to human suffering, but also beautiful, also capable of inspiring awe. I'd learned to hold both truths simultaneously, The world was dangerous and wonderful. People could be monsters and angels. Life could break you, and, if you were lucky and stubborn enough, you could rebuild yourself into something different but still worthwhile. At 75, I didn't know how many years I had left. My heart condition was managed but persistent. Some mornings, I woke up aching in ways that reminded me I was mortal. But I'd learned to appreciate each day not in spite of its ordinariness, but because of it. The simple pleasure of tea on the porch, the comfort of a friend's hand, the satisfaction of knowing I'd helped a few young people get their start in life. These weren't the grand victories stories celebrated, but they were victories nonetheless. I thought about writing everything down, leaving a record for whoever might need it. A warning about women like Simone, a testament to Darian's final act of protection, a guide for others who might find themselves tangled in similar webs. But perhaps this, right here, was enough. Living well, helping where I could, surviving with dignity and whatever grace I could muster. Darian's legacy wasn't just the money he'd left me. It was the lesson that love sometimes meant making hard choices. That protection sometimes meant secrets. That doing the best you could in impossible circumstances was all anyone could ask. I'd honored that legacy in my own way, not by seeking revenge, but by surviving, by using what he'd left me to do good, by refusing to let bitterness consume the years I had remaining. The sun finally broke through the fog, warming my face. Warren suggested we take a walk on the beach, and I agreed. As we made our way down the weathered steps toward the sand, I thought about Simone one last time, wondered where she was, who she was targeting now, whether Detective Ramirez would ever gather enough evidence to stop her permanently. Then I let it go. She'd taken enough from me. She didn't get to occupy my thoughts on this beautiful morning. I had a life to live, however many days remained. I had a friend waiting for me at the bottom of the steps. I had the ocean stretching before me, infinite and magnificent, and I had the knowledge that I'd survived the worst betrayal I could imagine, and I was still capable of joy. That was enough. That was everything. The waves crashed against the shore as we walked, washing away our footprints behind us, and I understood that this too was a kind of wisdom, knowing that nothing lasted forever, not pain, not love, not life itself. All we could do was walk forward, one step at a time, and find meaning in the journey. I'd found mine, and Darian, wherever he was, I hoped he knew that his final gift hadn't been the money or the property. It had been teaching me, even in death, how to protect myself while still remaining open to whatever beauty the world had left to offer. The beach stretched ahead, empty and inviting, and Warren and I walked into the morning, two survivors who'd learned that the opposite of despair wasn't happiness. It was simply the courage to continue. Extended Epilogue, Part 2. 3 more years passed, and the world kept turning in ways I couldn't have predicted. I was 78 now, moving a bit slower, my hands shakier when I poured my morning coffee. The heart condition that had sent me to the emergency room years ago required more careful management. I took pills at prescribed times, avoided stress when possible, and accepted that my body was a vessel with an expiration date I couldn't control. Warren had proposed marriage on my 77th birthday. We were sitting in his living room, listening to vinyl records. He had an impressive collection of jazz from the 50s and 60s, when he suddenly turned down the music and looked at me with those steady gray eyes. Delphine, I know we've both said we're content as we are, but I'm 83 years old, and I've learned that life is too short to let fear make all our decisions. He pulled out a simple gold band. I'm not asking you to combine our assets or change your name or even live together full-time. I'm just asking you to let me call you my wife. To let us have that official connection for whatever time we have left. I'd stared at that ring for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything I'd been through. The betrayal, the manipulation, the hard-won independence. But I'd also felt something else. The deep affection I had for this kind. Patient man who'd never pushed, never demanded, never tried to change me. Can I think about it? I'd asked. He'd smiled and put the ring back in his pocket. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. I'd spent weeks wrestling with the decision. I talked to Dr. Sato, who was now more of a friend than a therapist, though I still saw her monthly. I talked to Marcus, my attorney, who assured me we could structure things legally to protect both of our estates while still being married. Mostly, I talked to myself, in the quiet hours of early morning when the world was still, and my thoughts could unfold without interruption. What did I want from the years I had left? Safety. I had that, with or without marriage. Security. My finances were stable, my health monitored. But companionship? Real partnership? The comfort of knowing someone chose you? Not your assets, but simply you. That was different. I'd said yes 3 months later, on a drizzly Tuesday afternoon that reminded me of the day we buried Darian. The symmetry felt right somehow, starting something new on the same kind of day I'd ended something essential. We'd married at the courthouse with just 2 witnesses, Marcus and Raina, who'd become unlikely friends over the years. No big ceremony, no white dress, no celebration beyond a nice dinner at Warren's favorite restaurant, but it felt real. It felt like a choice I was making with open eyes and a cautious but willing heart. The prenuptial agreement was ironclad. What was mine stayed mine. What was his stayed his. In the event of death, our estates would go to our respective heirs. In my case, the scholarship fund and various charities. We maintained separate residences, though we spent most nights together now, alternating between his house and mine. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was honest, and that mattered more. The news about Simone came 6 months after the wedding. Detective Ramirez called on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in my garden, trying to coax my roses through an unusually hot summer, when my phone rang. Mrs. Pemberton, or should I say Mrs. Whitmore now. I'd kept my name, another small act of self-preservation. Just Delphine is fine. What can I do for you, detective? His voice was tight with barely contained excitement. We've arrested Simone Whitmore. Well, she was calling herself Sandra Morrison at the time, but we've confirmed it's her. My hand tightened on the phone. What happened? She made a mistake, got too confident, too sloppy. Married a man named Robert Castellano, 71 years old, widowed, comfortable but not wealthy. Within 2 months of the marriage, his children noticed irregularities, money moving out of accounts, changes to his will that he didn't seem to remember making. When they questioned her, she got defensive, aggressive. Ramirez paused. Then Robert ended up in the hospital with what looked like a stroke, but his daughter insisted on a full toxicology screen. They found elevated levels of prescription medications that shouldn't have been there. When they searched Simone's belongings, they found bottles of pills that matched what was in Robert's system. I sat down heavily on my garden bench. Is he alive? Yes, and he's talking. He's corroborating what his children suspected, that Simone had been gradually increasing his medications, making him confused and pliable. He's also identified her in photos with several of her previous identities. Will it stick? I asked, thinking of all the times she'd escaped consequences before. We think so. Between Robert's testimony, the physical evidence, and the pattern you and others helped us establish, we have a strong case. The DA is charging her with attempted murder, elder abuse, fraud, and about a dozen other counts. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching bees move between flower blossoms, feeling nothing and everything all at once. Relief that she'd finally been caught. Anger that it had taken this long, that Robert Castellano had nearly been another victim. And beneath it all, a deep, aching grief for my son, who might have been her victim in ways I'd never be able to prove. I called Warren and told him the news. Then I called Marcus and Raina. Then I walked to Darian's photograph on my mantle and stood there, looking into his young, hopeful eyes. They got her, sweetheart, I whispered. And it doesn't bring you back, but they got her. The trial took 18 months to unfold. I wasn't called to testify. My information was considered too circumstantial, too historical to be relevant to the specific charges against her. But I followed every development, reading the news articles Raina sent me, watching the case build from a distance. Robert Castellano's children were fierce advocates, refusing to let the prosecutors take any plea deal that didn't include serious prison time. They'd nearly lost their father, and they wanted justice not just for him, but for all the others who'd come before. Simone's defense was predictable. She was a devoted wife being persecuted by suspicious, greedy children who resented their father's happiness. The medications found in her possession were prescribed to her for her own conditions. Any financial irregularities were misunderstandings. But the prosecution had done their homework. They brought in handwriting experts who testified that Robert's will changes bore signs of forgery. They brought in pharmacologists who explained that the combination of medications in his system could only have been administered intentionally over time. They brought in Robert himself, now recovered, who testified clearly and powerfully about how Simone had isolated him from his family, controlled his access to information, and gradually made him dependent on her for everything. And they brought in Detective Ramirez, who outlined the pattern of behavior across multiple states and identities, painting a picture of a serial predator who targeted vulnerable older adults. The verdict came on a Friday in early spring. Guilty on all counts. I was sitting in Dr. Sato's office when I got the text from Reina. I'd scheduled the appointment intentionally, knowing I'd need support regardless of the outcome. Dr. Sato watched me read the message, my hand shaking slightly. "How do you feel?" she asked, in that gentle, non-directive way of hers. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel triumphant, or vindicated, but I mostly just feel tired." We talked for the rest of the session about closure, about how it rarely looked the way we expected, about how justice in the legal system didn't erase personal losses. Simone was sentenced to 25 years in prison. At 46 years old, she'd be 71 when she was released, older than most of her victims had been when she'd targeted them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I didn't attend the sentencing. I had no desire to see her again, to give her one more moment of my attention. Instead, I spent that day with Warren, taking a long drive down the coast, stopping at small towns and antique shops, eating fish and chips at a weathered oceanside restaurant, living my life, refusing to let her take one more day from me. But that night, alone in my house, I still maintained my own space, needing those hours of solitude. I pulled out all the documentation Marcus and Reina had compiled years ago. I read through every page, every piece of evidence that had helped build the case against her, and I cried for all of it. For Darian, for the men who died before anyone noticed the pattern, for Robert Castellano, who'd nearly become another statistic, for the years of my life spent carrying this knowledge. Then I took all those papers to my fireplace and burned them. I didn't need them anymore. The legal system had done what it could. The story was over, at least the part I could control. I kept only one thing, a letter Darian had written to me during his final week, which I'd found tucked in the will documents years ago, but had been too devastated to read at the time. I opened it now, my heart pounding, and saw his shaky handwriting covering 2 pages. "Mom, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've discovered what I left for you. I know you're probably angry that I didn't tell you about Simone while I was alive. You're probably hurt that I kept so many secrets. I'm sorry for that, but I need you to understand why. I discovered what she was about 8 months before I died. I hired an investigator, found the pattern, realized I'd been incredibly naive. By then, I was already sick, already dying, and I didn't have the energy to fight both cancer and a divorce from someone like her. More than that, I was terrified of what she might do to you if I left her with nothing. The investigator found suggestions, nothing provable, but suggestions, that she might have hastened at least 2 previous deaths when she felt threatened. So I made a choice. I gave her enough to satisfy her in the short term, and I protected everything else by putting it in your name, with legal structures that would expose her if she tried to claim it. I know that burden isn't fair to you, but you're the strongest person I know, Mom. You raised me alone after Dad died. You worked double shifts to give me opportunities. You taught me what real strength looks like. I trust you to handle this in whatever way feels right to you. Fight her if you need to. Settle if that's wiser. I just wanted to make sure you had options and protection. Please don't spend your remaining years in anger. Live well. Find joy where you can. Remember me with love, not bitterness. You gave me a beautiful life, even if it was shorter than either of us wanted. Thank you for that. All my love, Darian." I read it 3 times, tears streaming down my face. He'd known. He'd been protecting me the best way he knew how, with the time and resources he had. And his final wish wasn't for revenge. It was for me to live well. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a memory box I kept in my closet, alongside his baby pictures, his high school diploma, the program from his wedding. Then I called Warren, even though it was late. "Can you come over?" I asked when he answered. "Of course. Are you all right?" "I will be," I said. "I just don't want to be alone tonight." He arrived 20 minutes later, letting himself in with the key I'd finally given him after we married. He found me on the couch, the letter still in my hands, and simply sat beside me, pulling me into his arms. We didn't talk. We just sat there together, his heartbeat steady against my ear, until I fell asleep. When I woke the next morning, stiff from sleeping upright, Warren was still there, his arms still around me, and I realized that this simple, steady presence was what healing looked like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just someone choosing to stay. Extended Epilogue. Part 3. The seasons continued their rotation, indifferent to human dramas. I was 80 years old when I received the letter. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in October, mixed in with the usual bills and catalogs. The return address was from the Oregon State Correctional Institution, and I knew immediately who it was from. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but something, curiosity, perhaps, or the stubborn need to face things directly that had carried me through these years, made me sit down at my kitchen table and carefully open the envelope. The handwriting was still elegant, still carefully controlled. Delphine, I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness or understanding. But I've been in therapy here. Mandated, not voluntary. And my therapist suggested I write letters to the people I've harmed, whether I send them or not. I'm sending this one because you're the only person who might actually understand what I'm about to say. I've spent 4 years in here trying to figure out how I became this person. The therapist uses words like antisocial personality disorder and pathological narcissism, clinical terms that make it sound like I'm broken rather than evil. Maybe I am both. I didn't start out planning to hurt people. My first husband, I was 23, truly loved me, I think. He was older, stable, and I was tired of being poor, tired of struggling. When he died of a heart attack, the money that came to me felt like compensation for years of playing the devoted young wife. It got easier after that. Each time, the justifications came faster. They were old. They'd lived full lives. I gave them companionship in their final years. Why shouldn't I be compensated? With Darian, it was different. He was younger. He was kind. And he was dying anyway. I told myself I was making his last months easier, that I deserved to be taken care of after caring for him. But the truth is, I saw an opportunity and I took it. I always took the opportunity. I didn't kill him, if that's what you've wondered all these years. I didn't accelerate his medications or poison him, but I manipulated him when he was vulnerable. I isolated him from questioning voices, and I would have taken everything if he hadn't been smarter than I realized. You probably think this letter is another manipulation, another attempt to gain something. Maybe you're right. Prison hasn't made me a different person. It's just given me more time to think about who I've always been. I have 17 years left on my sentence, if I survive that long. I'm 50, and prison ages you faster than life outside. I'll be 67 when I'm released, the age of some of my victims. There's a certain justice in that, I suppose. I'm not asking for anything. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not even acknowledgement of this letter. I'm just telling you that I know what I did. I know what I am. And I'm sorry Darian's last months were tainted by my presence. He deserved better. Simone. I read the letter twice, then set it down with trembling hands. Warren found me there an hour later, still staring at the pages. What is it? He asked gently. I handed him the letter. He read it slowly, his expression darkening with each paragraph. What do you want to do with this? He asked when he finished. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me thinks it's just another manipulation. But part of me... I trailed off, not sure how to articulate the complex tangle of emotions. Part of you wants to believe people can change, Warren finished softly. Even people who've done terrible things. Is that foolish? He considered the question seriously. I don't think it's foolish to hold on to your humanity, even when dealing with people who seem to have lost theirs. We talked about it for hours that day. About accountability and redemption. About whether monsters were born or made. About how much compassion we owed to people who'd shown us none. In the end, I wrote a response. Just one paragraph, carefully considered. Simone, I received your letter. I don't forgive you, that's not something I'm capable of giving. But I acknowledge your words, and I hope that whatever time you have, in prison or after, includes genuine reflection and change. My son deserved better than what you gave him. So did all the others. I won't write again. Delphine Pemberton. I mailed it the next day, then tried to put it out of my mind. But it lingered. That letter. The questions it raised about human nature. and the possibility of transformation. Dr. Sato and I discussed it in our sessions. She reminded me that people were complex, that someone could be genuinely remorseful and still fundamentally unchanged, that my response to Simone's letter could be compassionate without being naive. You don't have to decide if she's sincere, Dr. Sato said. You just have to decide how you want to respond to the possibility of sincerity. I chose to respond with acknowledgement and distance. To leave the door neither open nor slammed shut, but simply closed. It felt right. My health began to decline more noticeably that winter. The heart condition that had been managed for years became more aggressive. I had 2 more episodes that sent me to the emergency room, each one more frightening than the last. Warren wanted me to move in with him permanently so he could monitor me, but I resisted. The independence of my small house felt essential to my sense of self, even if it was becoming more difficult to maintain. We compromised. I installed a medical alert system. He had a key and checked on me daily. I promised to be honest about how I was feeling, not to tough it out when I needed help. One morning in early spring, I woke up and couldn't get out of bed, not because I was too weak, though that was part of it, but because I looked around my small bedroom, the photographs on the dresser, the quilt my mother had made decades ago, the window that looked out on my garden, and I felt complete. This was enough. This life I'd built and rebuilt. This journey through loss and betrayal and survival. This was enough. I called Warren and asked him to come over. When he arrived, I was still in bed, propped up on pillows. I think it's time to talk about next steps, I said. His face went still. What kind of next steps? Hospice. End-of-life planning. Making sure everything is in order. He sat on the edge of my bed and took my hand. Has the doctor said something new? No, but I'm 80 years old, Warren. My heart is tired. My body is tired. And I'm okay with that. We spent the day going through my wishes. I'd already outlined most of it in legal documents. Cremation. Ashes scattered in the ocean near where Darian's ashes had been scattered. The scholarship fund and charitable donations were all arranged. But there were smaller things to discuss. Who got which photographs? The few pieces of jewelry that had meaning. My books. My garden tools. The vinyl records Warren had given me over the years. You can keep those. I told him about the records. Play them and remember me. Don't talk like that, he said, his voice cracking. Why not? Death isn't a failure, Warren. It's just the next thing. He leaned forward and kissed my forehead. You're the strongest person I've ever known. No, I corrected gently. I'm just someone who kept going. There's a difference. I enrolled in hospice care 2 weeks later, after another episode left me hospitalized for 3 days. The hospice nurses were wonderful, patient, kind, never treating me like a burden. I spent my days in a hospital bed moved into my living room, where I could see my garden through the large window. Warren stayed with me most of the time now, sleeping on the couch, reading to me when I couldn't focus on reading myself. Friends visited, the few I had left, other elderly survivors who understood that time was precious. We didn't talk about the past much. We talked about the quality of light, about birds we'd seen, about small pleasures that took on enormous significance. Marcus came by one afternoon, carrying the final paperwork for my estate. Everything's in order, he assured me. The scholarship fund is fully funded and will continue indefinitely. The rental properties will be sold, with proceeds going to the Cancer Research Foundation. Your personal effects will be distributed according to your wishes. He paused, then added more softly, Darian would be proud of what you did with what he left you. I hope so, I said. I tried to honor his intention, to use it for good while protecting myself. You did both, Marcus said firmly. You're a remarkable woman, Delphine. After he left, I thought about that word. Remarkable. I'd never felt remarkable. Just stubborn. Just determined not to let circumstances destroy me. Maybe that was enough to be remarkable. Raina visited a few days later, bringing photographs from her grandson's graduation. We looked through them together, and she told me stories about her family, her retirement plans, the garden she was planting. Thank you, I said suddenly. She looked surprised. For what? For helping me. For believing me when I told you about Simone. For fighting with me. Raina's eyes grew damp. You gave me something to fight for when I was burning out on all the cases I couldn't solve. You reminded me why I do this work. We sat together in comfortable silence, 2 women who'd faced darkness and survived. One evening, as the sun was setting and painting my living room in shades of gold and amber. I asked Warren to play the vinyl record we'd listened to the night he proposed. The jazz filled the room, soft and melancholy and beautiful. "Do you regret it?" Warren asked quietly. "Marrying me these last few years?" I looked at him, this kind, patient man who'd given me companionship without demands, love without possession. "Not for a second," I said. "You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. Trust, partnership, the knowledge that not everyone wants to take from you." He kissed my hand, and we listened to the music until I fell asleep. The dreams came more frequently now. Dreams of Darian as a child, laughing in my garden. Dreams of my late husband, solid and steady. Dreams of my parents, long gone. They weren't frightening dreams. They felt like welcomes. One morning, I woke to find Dr. Sato sitting beside my bed. I hadn't expected a visit from her. She'd retired the previous year, but there she was. "I wanted to check on you," she said simply. We talked for hours that day, about everything we'd worked through together, about grief and resilience and the strange, winding path of healing. "You've taught me so much," Dr. Sato said, "and about the capacity for survival, about holding on to yourself even when everything tries to strip you down." "I had good teachers," I replied. "You among them." She stayed until evening, and when she left, she hugged me carefully. "Thank you for letting me be part of your journey," she whispered. I knew, somehow, that it was goodbye. The hospice nurse increased my pain medication that week. The discomfort had been growing, my body slowly shutting down, but I was lucid, present, aware. Warren barely left my side now. He'd moved into my house completely, sleeping in the chair beside my bed, waking whenever I stirred. "You should rest," I told him. "You'll exhaust yourself." "I'm not missing a moment," he said stubbornly. "Not one." On what would be my last conscious day, though I didn't know it then, I asked him to open all the curtains, to let the spring sunshine flood the room. I looked around at this life I'd built, the photographs, the books, the small treasures that marked a life lived, not perfectly, not without pain, but authentically. I thought about Simone, still in prison, about whether she was truly changing or just passing time. I thought about Robert Castellano, who'd survived and was rebuilding his relationship with his children. I thought about the scholarship recipients, young people building futures because Darian's money had given them opportunity. I thought about all the ways one life rippled outward, touching others in patterns too complex to fully comprehend. "Warren," I said softly. He leaned close. "I want you to know something. These years with you, the second chance at partnership, it healed something in me I didn't think could be healed. You showed me that trust was still possible." His eyes filled with tears. "You showed me that love in later years can be just as profound as young love," he replied. "That two broken people can build something beautiful from the pieces." I smiled, feeling the sunlight warm on my face. "And we did okay, didn't we?" "We did better than okay," he said fiercely. "We did magnificently. That night, I slipped into unconsciousness. Peacefully," the nurses said, without distress. Warren held my hand through it all, talking to me even when I couldn't respond, telling me about his love, about his gratitude, about how I'd changed his life. And somewhere in that twilight between life and death, I felt something settle. Not completion. Life was too messy for that. But acceptance. I'd lived as fully as I could with what I'd been given. I'd survived betrayal without becoming bitter. I'd loved again without being naive. I'd taken Darian's final gift and transformed it into something that would outlive us both. That was enough. I died 2 days later, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, with Warren beside me and sunshine streaming through my window. The obituary was simple. Delphine Marie Pemberton, beloved mother, wife, friend, nurse for 40 years, creator of the Darian Pemberton Memorial Scholarship Fund. They didn't mention Simone. They didn't mention the betrayal or the fight. They only mentioned what I'd built, what I'd given, how I'd lived, and perhaps that was the truest victory of all. Final note. The Darian Pemberton Memorial Scholarship Fund continues to this day, supporting young people pursuing careers in skilled trades. To date, it has helped over 60 students achieve their dreams. Warren lived another 5 years after Delphine's death. He was buried beside her, overlooking the Pacific Ocean they both loved. Simone remained in prison, where she continues to serve her sentence. She has never written another letter. Robert Castellano recovered fully and became an advocate for elder abuse prevention, speaking at community centers and helping to draft stronger protective legislation. And sometimes, on the Oregon coast, when the fog rolls in and the morning light breaks through, people walking the beach report feeling a sense of peace they can't quite explain, as if someone who fought hard battles there is finally, truly at rest. The end.